There is a particular silence that falls over a room when someone says exactly the thing everyone else was too frightened to say. And it fell over the Everhollow cottage on a grey Tuesday afternoon, when Margaret Everhollow looked directly at the Duke of Blackthorn and told him her daughter deserved better than his fortune. Nathaniel Blackthorn had not expected this. He had expected, if he was honest with himself in the carriage ride over, a degree of overwhelmed gratitude bordering on disbelief. A modest countryside family suddenly presented with the prospect of a ducal alliance, the kind of social elevation that altered the trajectory of every subsequent generation. He had prepared himself for excessive deference, perhaps even tears. He had not prepared himself for a widowed mother in a patched apron looking him directly in the eye in her own modest sitting room, and informing him with the calm clarity of someone stating an obvious fact rather than issuing a challenge, that money was not the qualification her daughter required. "Your Grace," Margaret Everhollow said, her hands folded in her lap, with the particular steadiness of a woman who had raised 3 children alone after losing her husband and had long since stopped being intimidated by anyone's title. "I do not doubt your wealth. I do not doubt your position. I have heard from half the county that you are a generous landlord and a fair man in your dealings. But my daughter does not need a rich husband. She needs a good one. And I find I am not yet convinced you know the difference between the two." The sitting room held its breath. Clara, standing near the window with an expression of mortified horror that her mother had just spoken so directly to a duke, opened her mouth to apologize on her mother's behalf and found that no words arrived. Nathaniel Blackthorn, who had spent the better part of 11 years since his wife's death constructing an identity built almost entirely around his title and his resources, the things he could offer, the things that made him valuable in the careful arithmetic of London's marriage market, found himself, for the first time in longer than he could comfortably recall, entirely without a prepared response. "You are correct to question it," he said finally. "I am not certain I know the difference myself, Mrs. Everhollow. I have come here today believing my title and my fortune constituted a sufficient offer. I am only now understanding, from your very direct correction, that they may constitute nothing of the sort." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, something in her expression shifting from challenge to a more careful, considering assessment. "That is," she said, "a more honest answer than I expected to receive, Your Grace." "I find I have very little patience remaining for dishonest ones," Nathaniel said, "particularly regarding matters that affect your daughter's entire future happiness." Clara, by the window, was watching this exchange with an expression that had moved from horror to something considerably more complicated, the particular wary curiosity of a woman who had decided well before this conversation began that she had no interest whatsoever in becoming anyone's duchess, and who was now discovering that the man asking for her hand was responding to her mother's challenge with more genuine humility than she had expected from a man of his position. Nathaniel Blackthorn had married Charlotte when he was 26, in a match built on genuine devotion rather than the strategic calculation his position typically required, and he had spent 8 years believing he had been granted, against all reasonable odds, exactly the kind of marriage most men of his station never permitted themselves to hope for. She had died of a fever when he was 34, and he had spent the 11 years since constructing a careful, deliberate distance from anything resembling genuine emotional risk. He had managed his considerable estate with diminished but adequate attention. He had attended the social obligations his title required with a performance of engagement that fooled most observers and satisfied none of his own genuine feeling. He had decided somewhere in those 11 years that his capacity for the kind of love he had shared with Charlotte was simply exhausted, used completely, with nothing remaining for anyone else. He had come to Hollowfield, the small village near his northern estate, 6 months ago for reasons related to tenant management, and had encountered during that visit a young woman whose quiet kindness had been described to him by no fewer than 4 separate villagers before he had even properly met her. Clara Everhollow was 25, the eldest of 3 children raised by her widowed mother on income that had never been quite sufficient, and she had developed, across years of practical necessity, a particular generosity that asked nothing in return, sitting with the village's elderly when their own families could not, teaching reading to children whose parents had no time to manage it themselves, managing her own family's limited resources with a careful resourcefulness that left, somehow, always slightly more than expected for anyone in the village who needed it more urgently. She had also developed, across the same years, a clear-eyed skepticism regarding marriages built on anything other than genuine mutual respect. She had watched two of her closest friends marry for advantageous connection rather than affection, and had watched both marriages settle into a particular hollow loneliness that no fortune seemed capable of resolving. She had decided, well before any duke arrived at her cottage door, that she would rather remain unmarried than enter a union that asked her to trade her own genuine happiness for a title and an income. She had not expected the Duke of Blackthorn to take any particular notice of her during his estate visit. She had certainly not expected him to return 6 months later with a formal proposal that her mother would meet with such direct, unflinching challenge. "I do not understand," Clara said, finally finding words, once her mother's initial exchange with the Duke had concluded. "Why you have come here at all, Your Grace. We have spoken perhaps 3 times during your visit in spring. I do not believe that constitutes sufficient acquaintance for marriage." "You are entirely correct," Nathaniel said. "It does not. I am not here because I believe our acquaintance is sufficient. I am here because those 3 conversations were more genuine than anything I have experienced in 11 years of careful social performance, and I find I have been unable to stop thinking about them since." Clara looked at him with genuine surprise. "That is not the answer I expected," she said. "I find I have very few answers remaining that proceed as expected," Nathaniel said. "I came here prepared to offer you a title and a fortune, believing those things constituted a reasonable proposal. Your mother has just demonstrated with considerable clarity that I had not adequately considered what you might actually require beyond them." Margaret had not refused him outright. She had simply made clear, with the directness that would come to characterize the entire courtship that followed, that her daughter's hand was not available for purchase through wealth alone. Nathaniel had accepted this condition with a seriousness that surprised both women. "I would like permission," he said, "to spend time in this village, getting to know your daughter properly without the formal weight of my title intruding on the process. I will not arrive in my carriage with my usual retinue. I will not present myself as a duke conducting a courtship. I will simply be a man attempting to demonstrate that I am worth knowing on terms other than my fortune." Clara had agreed to this, somewhat to her own surprise, primarily because the alternative, an outright refusal that would have ended the matter immediately, felt, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, considerably less appealing than she expected. He returned the following week on horseback alone, dressed in clothing that, while clearly of fine quality, made no particular announcement of his rank, and spent the afternoon helping repair a fence on the Everhollow property that had been listing dangerously for months without anyone having the time or resources to properly address it. "You do not need to do this," Clara said, watching him work with a focused, genuine effort that surprised her considerably. "I do not need to," Nathaniel agreed, securing a post with the kind of careful attention he typically reserved for matters of considerably greater apparent importance. "I am choosing to, because I find that demonstrating care through action communicates considerably more than any amount of careful conversation could manage." Over the following weeks, he returned regularly, helping with practical village matters, sitting with elderly residents whose company Clara herself frequently sought, listening more than he spoke in a way that gradually revealed, beneath his initially reserved exterior, a man whose grief had taught him a depth of genuine attention that performance alone could never replicate. One particular afternoon proved especially revealing of his character when Clara brought him along on her regular visit to old Mrs. Pemberton, a widow of 70 whose own family lived too far away to visit with any regularity and whose company Clara had made a point of seeking out weekly for the past 3 years. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said, with evident surprise at finding a duke seated in her modest cottage, "I confess I did not expect such company today." "I am told you knew my late wife's family," Nathaniel said, settling into the chair Clara indicated with none of the formal stiffness Clara had half expected. Distantly, perhaps, through the Ashworth connection. Mrs. Pemberton's face lit with genuine pleasure. "I did indeed. I remember your wife's grandmother quite well. A remarkable woman, considerable wit, though I understand she passed before you would have known her." What followed was nearly 2 hours of conversation, Nathaniel asking genuine questions and listening with complete attention as Mrs. Pemberton recounted stories spanning 5 decades, her own marriage, her husband's death, fragments of history that connected, however distantly, to Nathaniel's own family. "You did not need to stay so long," Clara observed as they walked back toward the village afterward. "I wanted to," Nathaniel said simply. "I have spent considerable years attending social functions where conversation served primarily as performance. Careful exchanges designed to advance alliances or display wit, rarely intended as genuine connection. Mrs. Pemberton offered something I have not experienced in longer than I care to specify. A conversation that asked nothing of me beyond genuine presence. You listen the way someone listens when they have learned, through difficult experience, exactly how much it costs to lose the chance to listen properly," Clara observed on an afternoon several weeks into his visits, as they walked the village's outer lane together. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "Charlotte used to tell me I did not listen sufficiently," he said. "In our early marriage. I was young and ambitious, and frequently more concerned with my own thoughts than with genuinely attending to hers. I learned to listen properly only in the final years of her illness, when listening was, finally, the only thing I could still offer her. I have carried that lesson since, though I confess it arrived considerably later than it should have." "I am sorry," Clara said, "for her loss, and for the lesson's difficult timing." "Thank you," Nathaniel said. "I do not generally discuss her, though I find I do not mind discussing her with you, which surprises me given how recently we have come to know each other properly." They had reached, by this point, a particular ease in each other's company that surprised them both. The specific, comfortable quality of two people who had stopped performing for each other's benefit and had simply begun existing, genuinely, in shared silence and shared conversation alike. "May I ask you something direct?" Clara said. "Please," Nathaniel said. "Why me specifically?" she asked. "You could have any number of accomplished young ladies in London, women with considerable fortune and family connection, who would accept your proposal without a moment's hesitation. Why pursue someone your own society would consider, by every conventional measure, an unsuitable match?" Nathaniel considered this question with genuine seriousness. "Because those 3 conversations we had during my spring visit revealed something I had not encountered in 11 years, he said. Genuine warmth that asked nothing of me beyond honest engagement. You spoke to me during those brief encounters as a person rather than as a title requiring careful navigation. I found I could not stop thinking about how rare that genuine quality actually is, and how much I had missed it without fully realizing the absence." "That is," Clara said, "a more thoughtful answer than I expected." "I find I have very few answers remaining that do not require genuine thought," Nathaniel said. "You and your mother have rather effectively eliminated my capacity for careless responses. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments, have you ever met someone who proved, through action rather than words, exactly who they really were? The gossip reached London within a month, in the specific way news of an eligible duke's unconventional courtship always travelled fastest through exactly the circles most invested in its outcome. The Duke of Blackthorn, 11 years widowed and previously considered entirely unavailable to romantic pursuit, was apparently courting a village girl of no particular fortune or family. And London's ambitious mothers, who had spent a decade assuming Nathaniel permanently closed to their daughter's prospects, suddenly found the situation worth considerable, urgent attention. Lady Beaumont, whose daughter Sophia had been quietly positioned as a potential match for Nathaniel for several seasons, without any apparent encouragement from the Duke himself, arrived at a social gathering Nathaniel attended with the specific purpose of assessing this unexpected development directly. "Your Grace," Lady Beaumont said, with the careful diplomatic delicacy London's elite employed when probing for information they wished to appear above probing for, "I am told you have developed an interest in a young woman from Hollowfield. I confess considerable surprise, given your understandable reluctance toward romantic engagement these past many years." "The reports are accurate," Nathaniel said, with a directness that visibly startled Lady Beaumont. I have asked for Miss Everhollow's hand, and I am currently in the process of properly earning her trust, given that her family quite reasonably declined to accept my proposal on the basis of title alone." "Her family declined?" Lady Beaumont said with evident astonishment. "Her mother informed me quite directly that her daughter required a good man rather than a rich one," Nathaniel said. "I have found the correction considerably more valuable than any flattery I might otherwise have received." Sophia Beaumont, standing beside her mother, had remained quiet throughout this exchange, but her expression carried a particular complicated mixture of disappointment and, somewhat to her own credit, genuine curiosity about a situation that defied every convention she had been raised to expect from London's marriage market. "I find," Sophia said, "that I admire Miss Everhollow's mother considerably, sight unseen. Most families would have accepted your proposal without a moment's hesitation, Your Grace, regardless of whether the match served their daughter's genuine happiness." "I find I admire her as well," Nathaniel said, "considerably." The whispers that followed this exchange proved unkind in the specific way London's gossip typically proved unkind toward women in Clara's position. Speculation that she had calculated her family's apparent reluctance as a strategy to increase her own value, that her mother's directness was performance rather than genuine principle, designed specifically to make Nathaniel pursue what initial resistance suggested was difficult to obtain. Clara heard versions of this speculation when she accompanied Nathaniel to a small gathering several weeks into their courtship, at the home of a local gentry family whose connections extended into London's broader social circles. "I am told," one woman said with pointed delicacy, "that your mother's refusal was a clever strategy, Miss Everhollow. The Duke has pursued you considerably more ardently since, which suggests the strategy proved rather effective." Clara felt the specific sting of an accusation that misrepresented everything genuine about her mother's character. "My mother doesn't employ strategies," Clara said, with a directness she had learned over recent weeks from watching Nathaniel demonstrate the value of plain honesty. She spoke exactly what she believed, without any calculation regarding how the Duke might respond. If he chose to pursue our acquaintance further afterward, that decision belongs entirely to him, not to any scheme on our part. Nathaniel, overhearing this exchange, stepped forward with quiet but evident protectiveness. "Mrs. Everhollow's directness," he said, "is precisely what convinced me this courtship was worth pursuing honestly. I would ask that anyone discussing her character consider that distinction before repeating speculation that misrepresents it." The gathering's hostess, sensing the genuine tension the exchange had generated, quickly redirected conversation elsewhere, but the encounter left Clara considerably shaken despite Nathaniel's defense. "I do not know if I can manage this," she told him later, as he walked her home through the early evening. "The whispers, the speculation, the assumption that everything genuine between us must actually be calculation. I find I had not fully anticipated how exhausting this particular dimension of courting a duke would prove." "I understand," Nathaniel said. "I have managed this kind of speculation for considerably longer than you have, though I confess it has never previously affected me as personally as watching it directed at you and your mother." Clara's younger brother, Thomas, 15, and fiercely protective of his sister and mother both, had overheard enough of the village's own gossip regarding the courtship to voice his own concerns directly one evening at supper. "Will you actually stay?" Thomas asked Nathaniel bluntly during one of his now regular visits to the Everhollow cottage. "Or will London's pressure eventually convince you that marrying considerably beneath your station was a mistake, the way it apparently convinces every other gentleman who attempts something similar?" The directness, remarkably similar to his mother's own characteristic bluntness, caught Nathaniel slightly off guard, though he answered with genuine seriousness rather than dismissive reassurance. "I cannot promise you that society's pressure will not continue," Nathaniel said. "I can promise you that I have spent 11 years avoiding genuine connection precisely because I feared exactly this kind of difficulty, and I find I would rather face considerable difficulty alongside your sister than continue avoiding genuine feeling out of fear of what others might say about it." Thomas studied him for a long moment with the particular careful assessment of a younger brother, determining whether an answer satisfied his genuine concern or merely performed adequate reassurance. "That is a reasonable answer," he said finally. "I will reserve final judgment until I observe whether your actions continue matching it. That, Margaret said from across the table with evident approval, is precisely the correct standard to apply, Thomas. Well reasoned. The genuine turning point of their courtship arrived on an autumn afternoon, several months into Nathaniel's patient, unhurried demonstration of character, when Clara found him sitting alone near the small stream that ran along the edge of the village with an expression of quiet grief she had not previously witnessed on his increasingly familiar features. "You seem troubled," she said, sitting beside him with the easy comfort that had developed between them across months of genuine acquaintance. "It would have been our anniversary today," Nathaniel said. "Charlotte's and mine. 17 years had she lived." He looked at the water moving past them. "I find these particular days difficult to navigate even now, 11 years later. I had hoped by this point that the difficulty would have diminished considerably more than it actually has." Clara was quiet for a moment, recognizing the weight of what he was sharing. "I do not believe grief operates on a schedule that diminishes simply because considerable time has passed," she said. "I think it changes shape, perhaps, but I'm not certain it ever fully disappears, particularly regarding someone you genuinely loved." "You speak with considerable wisdom for someone who has not, I believe, experienced this particular kind of loss directly," Nathaniel observed. "I lost my father when I was 16, Clara said. "Not the same loss as a spouse, certainly, but I understand something of how grief lingers, regardless of how much time accumulates around it." Nathaniel looked at her with genuine attention. "I have been afraid," he said, with a directness that cost him visible effort, "that pursuing you represents some kind of betrayal of what I had with Charlotte. That loving again suggests the first love was somehow insufficient, or that I am attempting to replace something irreplaceable." "Do you believe that now?" Clara asked. "I am beginning to believe something different," Nathaniel said slowly. "I am beginning to believe that loving you would not replace what I had with Charlotte at all. It would simply be something new, built specifically around who you are, existing alongside the memory rather than instead of it." He looked at her directly. "I do not know how to fully articulate this without it sounding presumptuous, given how relatively brief our acquaintance remains, but I find that I have fallen in love with you, Clara, genuinely and considerably more completely than I believed myself still capable of feeling for anyone." Clara's eyes were very bright. "I did not expect to fall in love with a duke," she said. "I spent years deciding that titles and fortune were precisely the wrong foundation for marriage, having watched too many women I cared about sacrifice genuine happiness for exactly those things. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that what I have fallen in love with is not your title at all. It is the man who repairs fences without needing anyone to witness the effort. It is the man who listens more than he speaks, and who has spent months demonstrating, through consistent action rather than empty words, that he is exactly the kind of good man my mother insisted I deserved." "Your mother," Nathaniel said, "was entirely correct to challenge me. I am grateful, more than I can adequately express, that she did." "She will be pleased to hear you say so," Clara said with a small smile. "Will you marry me?" Nathaniel asked. "Not as a duke offering a title, but as a man who has genuinely earned, I hope, some measure of your trust and affection." "Yes," Clara said, unequivocally. "Though I suspect you should ask my mother's permission once more, given how thoroughly she has earned the right to a proper answer this time." Before approaching Margaret again, Nathaniel found himself confronting one final test of his resolve in the form of a letter from Lady Beaumont that arrived at his estate several days after his conversation with Clara by the stream. The letter was carefully worded but unmistakable in its intent. Lady Beaumont, having observed the considerable scandal his courtship continued to generate within London's social circles, wished to offer what she termed a more suitable alternative, reminding him that her own daughter Sophia remained available, accomplished, and considerably better positioned to manage the social responsibilities his title required. Nathaniel read the letter twice, then sat with it for some time, recognizing in its careful, well-meaning language exactly the kind of practical reasoning he had spent 11 years applying to his own life before Margaret Everhollow's direct challenge had forced him to examine whether such reasoning actually served happiness or merely protected against vulnerability. He wrote back the same evening. with a directness that mirrored everything Clara and her mother had taught him about honest communication. "Lady Beaumont, I appreciate your continued concern for my situation, and I recognize that your suggestion comes from genuine goodwill rather than any unkindness toward Miss Everhollow. However, I must be entirely direct. I am not seeking a suitable alternative. I have found, in Clara Everhollow, considerably more than mere suitability. I have found genuine partnership, honest companionship, and a family whose directness has taught me more about authentic character in 6 months than London society managed to teach me across 11 years of careful social navigation. I understand the scandal my choice generates. I have decided I would rather face that scandal honestly than continue avoiding genuine happiness simply because convention suggests I should prefer convenient calculation instead. With genuine respect and gratitude for your concern, Nathaniel Blackthorne." He showed the letter to Clara before sending it, wanting her genuine reaction, rather than simply presenting his decision as already settled. "You did not need to share this with me before sending it," Clara said, reading through his careful response with evident emotion. "I wanted you to know exactly how I am choosing to defend what exists between us," Nathaniel said. "Not as private reassurance offered only when we are alone, but as the same directness I am willing to extend publicly, regardless of what social cost that directness generates." "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "I find that matters considerably more than I can adequately express." The letter, once it reached London's broader social circles, through whatever channels such correspondence inevitably travelled, did not entirely silence the gossip. But it shifted the conversation's tenor considerably, transforming Nathaniel from a duke whose unconventional courtship invited continued speculation into a man whose direct, public commitment suggested genuine conviction rather than passing infatuation. Lady Beaumont herself, somewhat to her own surprise, found herself genuinely moved by the letter's evident sincerity, and her subsequent attendance at Nathaniel and Clara's wedding the following spring proceeded not from social obligation, but from authentic, if somewhat reluctantly arrived at, respect. Before he returned with his formal request, Nathaniel sought a private conversation with Margaret alone, a decision he made deliberately, understanding that her approval mattered considerably more than mere formality required. He found her in her small garden, tending vegetables with the same practical competence she brought to everything within her household's management. "Mrs. Everhollow," he said, "I would like to speak with you before I formally ask for Clara's hand again. I find I want your genuine assessment, not merely your blessing." Margaret set down her trowel and looked at him directly. "What is it you wish to know?" she asked. "Whether you believe I have actually become the man you insisted your daughter required," Nathaniel said. "Not whether my actions have been adequate to secure permission, but whether you genuinely believe the character beneath them has changed." Margaret considered this question with the same careful seriousness she had applied to their very first encounter. "I watched my own husband," she said, "work himself into an early grave, trying to provide more than our circumstances reasonably allowed, because he believed a good husband measured his worth through what he could materially offer, rather than through how he treated the people depending on him. I loved him completely, and I grieved him terribly, and I promised myself, watching my daughters grow, that I would never permit any of them to marry a man who confused those two things as thoroughly as society generally encourages." She looked at Nathaniel with genuine, searching attention. "You arrived believing your title and fortune constituted sufficient offer," she continued. "I have watched you these past 6 months slowly discover that they constitute almost nothing of genuine value compared to the considerable evidence of character you have demonstrated since. The fence, Mrs. Pemberton, your patience with my son's understandable skepticism, your willingness to discuss your grief honestly rather than performing recovery you have not genuinely achieved." She paused. "Yes, Nathaniel, I believe you have become exactly what I insisted my daughter required. I am not granting permission as a formality. I am granting it because I have watched the genuine evidence and find myself thoroughly convinced." "Thank you," Nathaniel said, with evident emotion. "That means considerably more to me than I can adequately express." "You repaired my fence," she said, "without announcement, without expectation of anything in return. You sat with old Mrs. Pemberton when her own family could not manage the time, and you listened to her stories about her late husband with genuine attention rather than polite endurance. You have spent 6 months proving, through consistent action, exactly the character my initial challenge questioned. I have tried, Nathaniel said. You have succeeded, Margaret said, with a small, genuine smile that transformed her typically composed features. I would be honored to call you son, Your Grace. Though I will continue calling you Nathaniel, given that titles have never particularly impressed me, and I see no reason to begin now. I would prefer that considerably, Nathaniel said, with genuine warmth. I find I have had quite enough of being addressed by my title alone these past 11 years. I would like very much to simply be Nathaniel within this family. They were married in the small Hollowfield church the following spring, in a ceremony that drew, somewhat to London society's continued fascination, considerable warmth from the entire village that had watched Clara's quiet kindness for years, and had decided, with the specific practical wisdom of people who valued genuine character over social calculation, that she had found exactly the match she deserved. The preparations themselves had revealed, in small ways, exactly how thoroughly Nathaniel had absorbed the lessons of the preceding months. He had initially proposed a grand London ceremony, the kind his position typically required, before catching himself and asking Clara directly what she actually wanted, rather than assuming his own instinct should govern the decision. I want the village church, Clara said. I want Mrs. Pemberton in the front pew, and the children I have taught reading scattered throughout the congregation, and a celebration afterward that the entire village can genuinely attend, rather than merely observe from a respectful distance. Then that is precisely what we shall have, Nathaniel said without hesitation. Lady Beaumont attended, having developed across the preceding months a genuine respect for both Clara and her mother that surprised even herself. She had written to Margaret several weeks before the ceremony, in a letter that Margaret kept among her most treasured correspondence, expressing admiration for the courage it had taken to challenge a duke so directly, and gratitude for the example it had set regarding what genuine maternal protection actually required. Sophia Beaumont stood near the back of the church with an expression of genuine happiness for a match she had once viewed briefly as her own potential prospect. Having concluded, across the months of observing Nathaniel and Clara's developing courtship from a respectful social distance, that the match suited them both considerably better than any arrangement built on convenient social calculation ever could have managed. Margaret Everhollow sat in the front pew, watching her daughter marry a man who had earned, through months of patient demonstrated character, exactly the kind of devotion she had insisted her daughter deserved from the very first afternoon he arrived with his careful proposal and his assumption that fortune alone constituted sufficient offer. Thomas, now considerably warmer toward Nathaniel than his initial skepticism had suggested possible, stood as one of the witnesses, having spent the preceding months watching Nathaniel's consistent character with the careful attention of a younger brother determined not to be easily convinced and having arrived gradually at genuine respect rather than mere tolerance. When the ceremony concluded, Nathaniel turned to his new wife with an expression of genuine, unguarded happiness that 11 years of careful grief had not permitted him to feel until exactly this moment. "Your mother was right," he said quietly, as they walked from the church together, the entire village gathered around them with genuine celebration rather than formal social performance. "About everything." "She generally is," Clara said, with the small smile that had become, over their courtship, one of his favorite things in existence. "I find it is one of her more reliable qualities." The wedding breakfast that followed proceeded with a warmth entirely unlike the careful formal occasions Nathaniel had attended throughout his previous adult life. Mrs. Pemberton recounting stories to anyone who would listen, the village children Clara had taught reading presenting her with handmade cards expressing genuine affection, Thomas offering a toast that managed to be both genuinely teasing and genuinely warm in equal measure. "I did not expect," Thomas said, raising his glass, "to genuinely like a duke. I find I have been proven entirely wrong, which I am told happens to most people who encounter my new brother-in-law's actual character, rather than merely his title." to Nathaniel and Clara, and to the considerable courage it took both of them to risk genuine love after everything that might reasonably have convinced them to avoid the risk entirely. 5 years after a widowed duke arrived at a humble cottage, expecting his wealth to constitute sufficient proposal, and was instead taught by a mother's direct challenge exactly what genuine love required, Nathaniel and Clara Blackthorne stood together in the garden of their northern estate, watching their 2 children play in the late afternoon light. Margaret visited regularly, having moved at her own insistence rather than any obligation Nathaniel imposed into a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds, close enough to remain genuinely present in her grandchildren's lives, independent enough to maintain the particular self-sufficient dignity that had defined her entire character throughout decades of widowhood and careful, resourceful management. She had become, somewhat unexpectedly, a figure of genuine respect within the broader estate community as well. Tenants and staff alike had discovered over the years that Margaret Everhollow's direct, unflinching honesty extended considerably beyond her own family, and that her assessment of any situation typically proved more useful than careful diplomatic vagueness ever managed. "You are thinking about that first afternoon," Clara observed, recognizing her husband's particular quality of contemplative silence. "I am thinking," Nathaniel said, "about how certain I was that my fortune and title constituted a reasonable offer, and how thoroughly your mother corrected that certainty within minutes of meeting me. I find myself profoundly grateful even now that she possessed the courage to challenge a duke directly, rather than simply accepting whatever advantage his wealth appeared to offer." "She taught you something most people never learn," Clara said. "That genuine nobility has very little to do with titles, and considerably more to do with the courage to be honest, the patience to demonstrate character through action, and the willingness to love again after loss has taught you every reason to remain protected." "She taught me that," Nathaniel agreed, "and you taught me how to actually live it." Their daughter, 6-year-old Margaret, named with full deliberation for the grandmother whose direct challenge had set this entire story in motion, ran toward them with the particular delighted urgency of a child wanting her discovery witnessed. "Mama! Papa! Come see what I found!" They went together, as they always did, to examine whatever remarkable thing their daughter had discovered. A particularly interesting beetle, as it turned out, which young Margaret held with the same fearless curiosity that suggested she had inherited her grandmother's complete absence of unnecessary intimidation regarding anything, however initially unfamiliar. "It is excellent," Nathaniel said, examining the beetle with the genuine attention he brought to everything that mattered to the people he loved. "Considerably more interesting than most of the formal correspondence currently awaiting my attention." "Will you tell us the story again?" young Margaret asked, with the particular persistence of a child who had decided a particular family story was her favorite. "The one about grandmother and the rich man?" "He was not merely a rich man when the story properly concludes," Clara said, settling onto the garden bench with her daughter beside her. "That is rather the entire point of the story." "Once," Nathaniel said, kneeling beside his daughter and her son both, "there was a duke who believed his fortune made him worthy of anything he desired. And then a mother looked him directly in the eye and told him exactly what he still needed to become." He told the story again, as he had told it many times before to his children, and would continue telling it for years to come, and found, as he always found, that the telling never diminished its genuine power, that true nobility, it turned out, had never required the title he had spent his entire life believing constituted his primary worth, but simply the considerable courage to listen when someone brave enough told him the truth, and the patience to spend however long necessary proving that truth had genuinely transformed him. Margaret Everhollow, watching from her own garden bench nearby, listened to her son-in-law tell the family's foundational story with the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who had taken a considerable social risk, challenging a duke's assumptions so directly, and had watched that risk produce exactly the outcome she had hoped for, but had not been entirely certain she would live to see. Her daughter, genuinely happy, married to a man whose character had been thoroughly tested and had proven, consistently and completely, worthy of the trust both women had initially withheld. "You did well," she said quietly to herself, watching her grandchildren laugh at their father's familiar story. "You did very well indeed." He believed his fortune and title constituted sufficient offer for any woman's hand. She believed her daughter deserved considerably more than wealth could ever purchase. And in the space between a direct challenge and months of patient, genuine action, two guarded hearts discovered that true nobility is never measured by what you possess, but by the courage to prove, consistently and honestly, exactly who you are. Some proposals are answered with acceptance. The best ones are answered with a challenge that makes the answer actually mean something. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell us, what is the most important lesson a parent ever taught you about love? Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and the quiet bravery of becoming truly worthy of someone's trust.